Before our last session, before lunch, there's some very urgent announcements I needed to make. Surabhi Agarwal, if you're in the hall, please contact Rimjim very urgently. Savitri as well, if you're in the hall from the MEA, please do contact Rimjim. Ben Hammersley will be signing books at 1 o'clock outside. We've also had to bring the lunch into the pre-function area for those who are buying their lunch, and we are sorry about that, but as I said in the morning, we've got rained out. And finally, before I invite Daniel Wolpert on the stage, there are 25 very eminent artists who've painted specifically for this event under the idea of challenge of liberty. And they have talked about all the issues of censorship, religion, sexuality, culture, tradition, against which artists push their boundary. And when you have free time, do go to the atrium. The exhibition is there, and I'm sure you'd love to see it as well as buy art. Before we move for lunch, we have another wonderful scientist who explains to us radically, in a very disruptive way, what the brain is for. If you imagine the brain was for emotions and for thinking, you're wrong. He's a movement chauvinist, and he believes that the brain's primary function is to help us move. And he says this is why a computer can beat us at a chess game, but if it has to tie a shoelace, it looks radically more clumsy than a human being. Daniel Wolpert to explain to us why the brain is what it is. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm a neuroscientist, and as a neuroscientist, I have to deal with a lot of difficult questions about how the brain functions. But I want to deal today with the simplest question we can ever ask about the brain, and a really fundamental one if we want to know why we evolved one. And it's a question you really should have all thought about a long time ago. Can I have a slide? Why is it that we and other animals have brains at all? Not all species on our planet have brains, so if we want to understand what they're for, we should ask why we evolved one. Now, you may reason that we have a brain to think or perceive the world, and that's completely wrong. We have a brain for one reason, and one reason only, and that's to produce adaptable and complex movements. Now, that may surprise you, but think about it. The only way we have of affecting the world around us is through the contractions of our muscles. Now, that's not quite true. There's one other way to affect the world, and that's through sweating. But apart from that, everything else goes through muscle contraction. So think about communication, speech, gestures, writing, sign language. They all require you to contract your muscles to affect the world around you. So the only way you can modify your ability to survive in the world is through your movements. So it's important to remember that sensory and memory and cognitive processes are all important, but they're actually only important to drive or suppress future movements. So there's no evolutionary advantage of laying down memories of childhood or perceiving the color of a rose if it doesn't affect the way you're going to move later in life. Now, think about it. Trees and grass don't have brains and they don't have very good movement either. But if you don't believe in this argument, here's the clinching evidence. This is the humble sea squirt, a very rudimentary animal, and it has a nervous system, an eye, and it swims around in the ocean in its juvenile life. And at some point in its life, it implants on a rock, and it never leaves that rock again. And the first thing it does in implanting on that rock is to digest its own brain and nervous system for food. So once you don't need to move, you no longer need the necessity of that brain. In fact, this creature is taken as an analogy to what happens in universities when professors get tenure, but that's a different issue. So I am a movement chauvinist. I believe the brain is there for movement. Don't let anyone tell you it's not. So if the brain is there for movement, the question is, how well are we doing understanding how the brain controls movement? And the answer is we're doing extremely poorly. It's a very difficult problem. But let me illustrate how difficult it is by asking how well we're doing building machines that can do what humans can do. If we take the game of chess, and we say, what about getting machines to decide what piece to move where, and we pit Garry Kasparov, when he's not in jail, against IBM's Deep Blue, the answer is that IBM's Deep Blue will win occasionally. And I expect if that computer played anyone in this room, it would win every time. So that problem is effectively solved. What about the problem of picking up a chess piece, dexterously manipulating it and putting it back down? If we put a 5-year-old child's dexterity against the best robots of today, the answer is very clear. The child wins easily. So why is that top problem so easy and the bottom one so hard? And one reason is a very smart 5-year-old child could tell you the algorithm or computer code to solve the top one. Look at all possible moves to the end of the game, and look at the one that makes you win. It's a trivial algorithm. Now, it's true there are many possible moves, but with fast computers and some approximations, we can get close to the optimal answer. When it comes to the bottom problem, we've got no idea what the algorithm has to be to make you dexterous. And as we'll see, you have to both perceive and act on the world, which has a lot of complexity. But let me just illustrate some cutting-edge robotic and human performance. So this is the end of a 3-year PhD at one of the best institutes for robotics. And a student has trained this robot in 3 years to pour out a bottle of water. And it's a hard problem because the water sloshes around, so it's a bit unpredictable. But it can do it. But as you can see, it does it with nowhere near the fluidity with which a human would do it. Now, if you want this robot to do a different task, that's another 3-year PhD. There's no generalization in robotics from one task to another. Everyone has to be hand-tuned to solve a particular task. Now, we can compare this instead to this lady, Emily Fox. This is her winning the world record for cup stacking. Now, cup stacking is a very popular sport in the US, and what you do is you have 12 cups, you have to stack and unstack in a prescribed order against the clock, and this is her world record attempt in real time. And she's pretty happy. So we have no idea what is going on inside her brain when she does that, and that's what my group tries to work out. So control of movement sounds easy. You send a movement command down, it causes contractions of muscle, your body changes its position, and you get sensory feedback from vision, from the skin, and from muscles. The trouble is, these signals are not the beautiful signals we want. Sensory feedback is what we call noisy. Now, I'm using the term noise not in the sense of sound. In engineering and neuroscience, noise means a corruption to a signal, things you don't want on signals. So it comes from the old days before digital radio, when you were tuning your radio station, you heard the that was the noise on the signal, the station you wanted to hear. So when you, for example, put your hand under a table and try to localize it with your other hand, you can be off by centimeters due to this noise. More than that, the commands you send down are noisy. When you're playing darts, forget about hitting the bullseye. Just to hit the same point over and over again, you can't, because effectively there's variability in the commands. And the outside world and tasks we perform are both ambiguous and variable. This teapot could be full, it could be empty, it changes with time. So we work in a huge sensory movement task soup of noise. This noise is actually so great that society is willing to reward those of us who can reduce the bad consequences of this noise. So if you're fortunate enough to be able to knock a small white ball into a hole several hundred yards away using a long metal stick, our society will give you hundreds of millions of dollars. But I want to convince you that the brain also devotes a lot of effort to reduce the bad consequences of this noise. And so what I need to tell you about is an overarching theory we have of how the brain deals with this noise and uncertainty. And it's called Bayesian decision theory. And this man here is Thomas Bayes. He was an English minister back in the 1700s. He wasn't particularly famous in his life, but after he died, a friend of his found an interesting mathematical paper among his possessions and sent it in to the editor of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, saying, I now send you an essay which I have found among the papers of our deceased friend, Mr. Bayes, and which, my opinion, has great merit. Now, fortunately for us, the editor of that journal was not as difficult as he is today and did not ask for major revisions to the paper, given that the author was dead, but instead published it as essays towards solving a problem in the doctrine of chance. And it was really forgotten for hundreds of years, but more recently it's become a major branch of statistics, and more recently than that, a unifying way to think about how the brain deals with uncertainty. And there are two components now to it, which is extensively developed from the days of Bayes. There's Bayesian statistics, which say, how do I make inferences about the world? How do I estimate what I'm looking at, what my limbs are, what time lunch will be? And then the second part is a decision theory. Having made my best guesses about the world, how do I decide the best actions to choose? And we'll go through both of those. So let me try to explain to you what the inference part is. What it says is we have to... What is a belief? A belief is a proposition. Am I looking at a cat or a dog? Are my arms in this position or this position? What will we serve for lunch today? These are all things I want to generate beliefs about. And the way I'm going to represent beliefs is with numbers between 0 and 1. 0 means I don't believe it at all. 1 means I do believe it. And numbers in between give me my shades of uncertainty. So effectively, we're using probabilities to represent beliefs. So if you say to me, do you think all ravens are black? I might say I'm 0.9 sure. I believe it, but I'm not completely convinced. How do we form beliefs? Well, what Bayes' rule says is there are two sources of information you can use to form belief, and only two. There is data, and when it comes to the brain, data is sensory input. I get things from vision, from touch. That's my input. But there's another source of information from which I can form belief, and that's memory. I can store information either through learning or genetically encoded, and I can use that to influence my belief. And so one reason we can ask is, why do people have different beliefs? Well, the only reason you can have different beliefs is you have different genetically encoded or different memories, or you have different data. And so the reason we have different beliefs about Iran and Israel is because these things vary between people. So what I'm showing you below is the actual equation for Bayes' rule. I'm not going to go through it, but I want you to know this is the most beautiful equation there is, and probably the one which may in the end explain how the brain works. Although it looks simple, it's got amazing explanatory power, and it's a very powerful set of equations. But let me try to give you an intuition for Bayes' rule, how it really relates to when we learn movements. Imagine you're playing tennis, and you're trying to estimate where the ball is going to bounce as it comes over the net. So you want to generate a belief of that location. Well, Bayes' rule says there are two sources of information. There's sensory input, and I can use vision, I can use my hearing to produce an estimate. And I might produce an estimate which says it's going to be in the middle of that red cloud there, and the red cloud represents the numbers between 0 and 1 based on vision. And the reason it's not a single point is your visual system is not perfect. So although you'll think it'll be in the middle, there's some chance it might be spread out from there. That information is available on the current shot. But there's another source of information not available on the current shot, which is the memory. The fact that the ball doesn't bounce with equal probability over the court. If you're playing against a very good opponent, they may distribute the ball in the green area, for example. And so what Bayes' rule says is to make the best estimate, I should combine both these sources of information. And the way you do that is you multiply the numbers in the green by the numbers of the red to get a new distribution over the belief shown in the yellow. And the blue would be your best guess. Now, I wouldn't tell you all this if it wasn't that we showed a number of years ago. This is just how people behave. We are Bayesian learners. We learn about statistics of the outside world as we go around it, but we also know how variable our own sensory apparatus is and combine it in a Bayesian world. So we really are Bayesian learners, and one fundamental component of Bayes' rule is this part of the formula. What this really says is the brain has to predict the future. It has to predict the information the sensory inputs will get to do proper Bayesian estimation. And what I want to convince you now is that the brain does make those predictions, and it fundamentally changes the way you perceive the world. So we send a motor command down, and it changes the body, and we get sensory feedback. And that transformation from the command we send out to the information I get back is governed by the physics of my body and my sensory apparatus. But we can think about what might go on inside the brain, and that white box there is the brain. We can think about a little neural simulator of that. So as you send the command down, you tap off a copy of that command and run it through a neural simulator, which is going to try and predict the feedback you're going to get. So as you shake this ketchup bottle, the bottom row shows the true feedback the brain gets, and the upper row shows the prediction of the feedback you think you're going to get. And you could see how you could learn such a predictor. You compare the prediction with the reality, and you could update the parameters in that box to make the predictor better and better. So why on earth would you bother to predict something you're going to get anyway? Well, there are lots of good uses. Imagine now someone very kindly comes and taps on that ketchup bottle for me while I'm shaking it. Now I'm getting another source of sensory information due to their action. So I get, due to me shaking it, I've got some sensory information. Due to you tapping on it, I get information. But from my sensor's point of view, they're combined together into one source. Now, there are good reasons to believe you want to be more attuned to external events, such as someone else doing something, compared to feeling everything I'm doing myself. So how can we separate these off? Well, the top row prediction is predicting just based on my commands. So if I subtract that off from the total feedback, I should recover the external event. So the idea is I go around the world, I predict everything due to me, everything left over is due to external events. It's a way of filtering out information. What evidence is there for this? We decided to look at the most obvious example of where when you do something to yourself, it feels very different than if someone else does it to you. And that example is tickling. So it's very easy to be tickled by someone else, but very hard to tickle yourself. And the question is it this predictive mechanism which is stopping you tickling yourself? So people had proposed this back in the 50s, but did not have the technology to address the question. So we can bring this into 21st century by applying robotic technology to the problem. And so the idea is very simple. People hold a stick in one hand attached to a robot, and they're going to move that back and forward. And we're going to track that with a computer and use that motion to control another robot, which holds a small stick, which is going to tickle the palm of their hand. And then we're going to ask them to rate how ticklish the sensation is. And I'm only going to show you one small part of the study. And I'm not showing you the robots here. What people do is they use their right hand to oscillate back and forward, and then that's replayed to the other hand with different time delays. So for example, if you move up and down here, perhaps we replay it with a lag of 1/10 of a second. So the critical point here, wherever the lag is, the motion of the right hand is the same, the input to the left hand is the same, it's just an oscillating tickle. But what we see, the tickle rating as we go from no delay, such as you're just tickling yourself, to 1/10 of a second becomes greater. As we go from 1/10 of a second to 2/10 of a second, it becomes greater still. And by 2/10 of a second, it's as long as if the robot just tickles you. So whatever's canceling out the tickle sensation, it's extremely tightly coupled to temporal causality. And based on this and other experiments, we showed conclusively the reason you can't tickle yourself is because your brain is forced to make predictions and cancel off the sensation. Now, I have to admit these are the worst experiments we've ever run in my lab. We have to have large numbers of subjects to get this effect. The palm isn't particularly ticklish. Ticklishness goes and comes. It's a mess. So we were looking for another way to really measure objectively this cancellation phenomena. And I had 2 children in the intervening years. I actually have 2 girls. But what you'll notice, particularly when they're on back seats of cars on long journeys, they get into these fights, where one does something to the other one retaliates, and it quickly escalates out of control. And this happens all the time, and when I used to shout at my children to stop, sometimes they would both claim the other person hit them harder. Now, I know my children don't lie, and I felt as a neuroscientist it was my job to explain how they could be telling inconsistent truths. And we hypothesized, based on our tickling study, that when one child hits another, they've generated the command for that hit, and therefore the sensory input they get is predicted and they subtract it off. So they'll feel the blow as less than it really is. But the poor child who receives the blow doesn't get to make that prediction, and therefore feels the full blow. So if they retaliate with the same force, the first child will think it's been escalated. Okay? So we decided to test this in the lab. Now, we don't work with children, we don't work with hitting, but the idea is very similar. We're going to bring 2 people in, and make them play a tit-for-tat game where they basically have to touch each other with the same force they were touched by the other person. So they sit opposite each other like this. Each subject has their index finger of their left hand under a little lever with a force transducer, so we can measure the force. And the game starts off as follows. One of the motors generates a small force on their finger for 3 seconds and stops. And that subject's been told, remember the experience of that force, and when the motor stops, use your other hand to apply the same force you experienced down to the other subject's finger for 3 seconds, then stop. And then player two's been told, remember the experience of that force, use your other hand to apply the force back down. Now, critically, we tell them the rules in separate rooms, so they don't know the rule the other person is playing by. And as they carry on playing this game, trying to apply the same force they experienced, we can measure the force. And what we can do is plot here the force measured by the transducer as affecting the number of turns. The red dotted line would be perfect performance. It's the force the motor first started with, and if they did tit for tat, it would carry on flat. And what we see in all pairs of subjects is this: a massive escalation in force over 5 turns to about 5 newtons, which is painful on the finger, and we stop. And we ask subjects, what rule do you think the other person was playing by? They'll say things like, well, they were being told to double it. So this is really an example of where you underestimate the consequence of your action. And this tends to be true of most perceptual things. When I speak, I think I'm speaking quieter than I am. An interesting question is how much does this transfer to the cognitive domain? When we ask about wars and escalation, it's probably a general phenomena that actions I take are discounted relative to external events. Okay, beliefs of no use without actions. So the next question is, how are we going to generate our actions? And the problem the movement system has is, however simple or complex the task, there are actually infinitely many different ways you could achieve the same goals. So take a very simple task of moving from one point in space to another. There are infinitely many different paths my hand could take. For example, I'm showing you 2 here. And if I choose a particular path, I can hold my hand on that path with infinitely many different joint configurations. And if I choose a particular joint configuration, because I've got lots of muscles in my arm, I can actually hold my arm there either very stiff or very relaxed. So I have a huge amount of choice to make when I generate movements. So the question is, how do we choose our own movements? And it turns out we're extremely stereotypical, meaning we all move pretty much the same way. We don't have to, we just somehow have chosen those solutions. And it turns out those solutions have been around for so long that our brains have got dedicated neural circuitry to interpret the stereotypical movements. So I'm going to set these dots in motion in a minute, and even though these dots are a very poor representation, because the motion is biological, you will instantly know what is going on. You'll know whether this person is happy or sad, whether they're old or young, male or female, and what they're doing. If these were cars going around a racing circuit, you'd have no idea. So the fact we can extract biological motion suggests it's really a very ancient phenomena. And so now we can ask, why is it we move the way we do? And we come back to evolution. Perhaps we don't all move quite the same way. Perhaps those of us who move better than others have got more chance of getting our children into the next generation. So on an evolutionary scale, movements improve and improve over time. And maybe through our life, learning is there to improve movements. And the question becomes, how do we rate a good versus a bad movement? And the answer is, we're going to come back to noise. So imagine, here are 2 possible ways I could reach to catch a ball. They end up at the same place, but they have different paths. If I chose to do the left-hand one, I could work out the forces required as a function of time to achieve that movement, shown here. But the trouble is, noise affects the movement. So what I actually get is a noisy version of that command, which will mean I get variability in the movement. If I have the same desired command again, noise will be different, so I'll get a different movement. So what I can show you in here in cartoon form, if I make that movement, how the distribution of variability might evolve. So that's what I might have in terms of my variability of the movement. If I move a different way, the way on the right, I'll have a different desired command, different noise. Through playing through a complex system, all bets are off. All we can be sure about is the distribution of variability will be different. And if I move like the right-hand way, I'll end up with a different distribution. So if I say to you, which way would you rather move, I hope we would all choose the right-hand one, because the variability is smaller. So the fundamental idea of the model we developed is that you choose to move in a way that minimizes the bad consequence of the noise. And based on this model, we can explain a huge variety of how humans move. It also suggests two ways in which people are more skilled than others. One way that Tiger Woods might be a better golfer than me is he may have been bored with inherently less noise. And therefore, however much I practice, I can't get rid of that variability. An alternative is we all have the same noise, but actually finding the optimal solution is not trivial. And therefore, he's just found it, and I need more practice. My personal belief is people are born with fundamentally different levels of noise, and it'd be nice at birth if we could tell people whether they should be going to tennis or not. Okay. I hope I've convinced you the brain is there to control movement, and effectively understanding a movement means understanding the brain, so it's a great intellectual challenge. But it has real implications to understand the control of movement, because many diseases which afflict people affect movement, from multiple sclerosis to motor neuron disease to stroke and Parkinson's. And so part of what we try to do is understand the normal control so we can understand disease, and particularly apply new techniques to rehabilitation for those who have those diseases. And finally, if we really understand how humans control movement, we could apply that to robotic devices to make them much better. Finally, I hope from now on, when you see creatures doing what look like very simple tasks, please remember the complexity that's going on inside their heads. Thank you.